She was Luna of the most powerful pack in the Northern Territories. She stood beside an Alpha King. She bled for his wars, built his alliances, and loved him like the ground loves roots. Deep, unconditional, invisible. And on a Tuesday night in the middle of a rainstorm, she found him with his hands on another woman inside the sacred chamber that was supposed to belong only to them. What Selena Voss did next, what she chose, what she lost, and what she became, will change everything you think you know about loyalty, power, and survival. Stay until the end. Drop your city in the comments right now. Let me know who's watching with me tonight. She heard the rain before she heard anything else. It came hard off the mountain ridges, the kind of rain that didn't fall so much as a salt, sideways, cold, smelling of iron and pine, and something older than either. Selena stood at the far end of the corridor outside Kael's private chamber, with water dripping from the hem of her cloak onto stone floors that had never once felt warm to her feet, and she told herself she was imagining things. She'd been telling herself that for 3 months. The walk from the eastern wing had taken her 11 minutes. She'd counted without meaning to, the way you count things when your body already knows something your mind refuses to accept. 11 minutes through darkened hallways, past guards who didn't meet her eyes, past servants who stepped aside a half-second too quickly. She'd woken at midnight to find his side of the bed cold, and she'd lain there for 40 minutes staring at the carved ceiling before the weight of it became unbearable. Luna of the Northern Pack. That was her title. Mate to Alpha King Kael Draven. That was supposed to mean something in this world. The door to the sacred chamber was not fully shut. Light spilled through the gap, firelight, orange and unsteady, and with it came warmth and voices kept deliberately low, and Selena stood with one hand flat against the cold stone wall and understood in that moment that the threshold between before and after was this exact hallway, this exact strip of orange light, and once she crossed it, she would never be able to put herself back the way she was. She pushed the door open. Kael Draven stood with his back mostly to her, broad-shouldered, dressed in the loose linen shirt he wore only when he believed himself unwatched. His hand was at the jaw of a woman Selena did not recognize, dark-haired, tall, dressed in riding clothes still dusty from the road, eyes that caught the firelight, with something too steady to be innocence. His thumb traced the line of her cheekbone the way he used to trace Selena's. The chamber held the altar where Selena had pressed her palm against Kael's and spoken words that could not be unspoken. The same altar, the same fire, the same stone walls engraved with the sigils of bonded mates. Neither of them heard her at first. "She doesn't need to know yet," Kael was saying, his voice low and flat, the voice he used when he'd already made decisions he wasn't planning to negotiate. "Not until the gathering. She'll figure it out before then," the woman said. "Lunas always do." "Let her." The word hit Selena somewhere between her sternum and her spine. Not let her find out. Not let her ask. Let her. As though her figuring out the truth was a minor inconvenience he'd already factored into his plans and dismissed. She didn't scream. She thought later that she would have, if she were the person she'd been 2 years ago. The girl who'd arrived at the Draven estate with a pack of her own wolves and an alliance offer her father had negotiated, and a belief, genuine and complete, that mating an Alpha King meant something binding on both sides. That girl would have screamed. Instead, she said, very quietly, "Kael." He turned. She watched his face move through 3 expressions in under 2 seconds. The first was surprise, real and unguarded, and that surprised her in turn, because Kael Draven was a man who manufactured composure the way other men manufactured weapons, carefully, deliberately, as a tool of power. The second expression was something she couldn't fully name, adjacent to guilt but not quite reaching it, something that looked more like calculation. The third was the one that settled, cold, closed. The face he wore in council meetings when someone had come to him with a problem he'd already decided wasn't worth his time. Selena. Not her name as he used to say it, her name as a period at the end of a sentence he'd already finished. "Who is she?" Not a question. Her voice surprised her, how level it was, how empty of the trembling she could feel in every muscle below her collarbone. The woman beside him didn't move, didn't apologize, didn't have the grace to look away. She stood with her shoulders square and her hands relaxed at her sides, and she watched Selena with eyes that held something worse than contempt. Assessment. As though Selena were a variable being entered into an equation. Her name is Marin, Kael said. She's here on political business. In the sacred chamber. Selena kept her eyes on his. With your hand on her face. At midnight. Don't. Don't what? Don't do this here. The edge in his voice now, just enough to function as a warning. You're reading into what you saw and you're going to embarrass yourself. Something in Selena's chest cracked. Not broke, not yet, but cracked. The hairline fracture of a thing that had been under pressure for too long. I'm reading into it, she said. I came to the chamber where we made our bond and found you touching another woman in the dark, and I'm reading into it. Lower your voice. There's no one here to hear me. That is not the point. He crossed toward her in 3 long strides, and the closer he got, the more she understood, viscerally and without wanting to, that she had stepped into a confrontation he'd already mapped. He'd had this conversation before, not with her, but in his head, in the way he prepared for every negotiation, rehearsed and positioned before the other party even opened their mouth. You're going to listen to me, he said, voice dropped so Marin couldn't hear. And his presence this close was still what it had always been, overwhelming, the kind of physical authority that operated below conscious thought and made the animal parts of her want to defer. She'd spent 2 years learning not to let it work on her. Tonight it barely touched her. You're going to go back to the East Wing. You're going to sleep, and in the morning we will discuss whatever concerns you have in a civilized manner. Concerns, she said. Selena. You're in the mate chamber with another woman at midnight, and you're asking me about being civilized. His jaw tightened. I am asking you to be the Luna this pack needs, not a jealous girl throwing a scene over something she doesn't understand. The word jealous landed like a slap. She felt it in the way she felt cold water, and sudden, total, over everything at once. I want to understand, she said, and she hated how honest it was, hated how much of herself was still standing in that sentence with her arms open. Tell me what's happening. Tell me who she is. Tell me what political business requires you to touch someone like that in our chamber at midnight, and I will listen, Kael. I will listen. He looked at her for a long moment, and in that moment she believed fully and absolutely that he was going to tell her, that whatever was happening was explicable, that she was going to feel foolish and relieved in equal measure, and she was willing to accept that. She was willing to be wrong. He said, Go to bed. The belief caved in. She went to bed. Not because he told her to, because her legs carried her back down the corridor and her body was operating on some autonomous instruction that had decided, before her mind caught up, that there was no more to be done in that hallway tonight, and that standing there any longer was a form of bleeding in public. She did not sleep. Morning came gray and without mercy, and Selena sat at the edge of the bed dressed in her formal Luna wear, midnight blue, the Draven emblem embroidered at the cuff, the kind of thing she wore when she intended to be seen, and waited. Kael did not come. An hour past dawn, his steward arrived with a message that the Alpha King was engaged in council business and would speak with her at the evening meal. The steward was a young man with careful eyes who had been looking at her with exactly that carefulness for 3 months, and Selena wondered, staring at the folded note, how many people in this estate already knew what she'd only found out last night. She was asking herself that when the council chamber doors opened for the morning session and she walked in. She had every right to be there. The Luna of a pack held council standing, always had. It was written into the old laws, the ones that predated Kael's grandfather and his grandfather before him, the ones that couldn't be stripped without a formal challenge. No one greeted her. 4 advisors sat around the stone table and Kael stood at its head, and the woman Marin was seated at his left hand, which was not a seat for a visitor. Visitors sat at the far end. The left hand of an Alpha King was for his inner circle. Luna Voss, said Cassian, who was Kael's head of security, and had once, 2 years ago, told her she was the steadiest person Kael had ever brought into his house. He said her title the way you say something you've been instructed to say. She sat down. Continue, she said. Kael looked at her across the table. His face gave nothing. They discussed border patrol adjustments for 20 minutes. They discussed grain allocation for the southern settlements. They discussed, with great and measured care, absolutely nothing about the woman seated at Kael's left hand, who contributed 3 comments to the discussion that were received with the kind of weight and consideration that told Selena exactly how long this had been going on before last night. Then Edric, the eldest advisor, said something that was either incompetence or deliberate. "My lord, regarding the Luna's proposed trade amendments, Marin has a different framework to propose that may serve us better." Silence. Selena kept her eyes on Edric. She felt Kael's gaze move to her and then away. "Walk me through the framework," Kael said to Marin. The trade amendments had been Selena's. She'd spent 4 months building them, visiting 3 southern territories, sitting with pack merchants in their homes, learning, taking notes in a small leather journal she still kept in her desk drawer. She'd presented them to Kael 6 weeks ago. He'd said they were good. He'd said he'd bring them to council when the timing was right. She sat at that table and listened to another woman dismantle her work piece by piece and replace it with something that had come from wherever Marin had come from, and she understood that the timing had never been the issue. "I'd like to speak," Selena said. The room went quiet in a specific way, not the quiet of attention, the quiet of people preparing for something uncomfortable. "The framework being proposed supersedes work I did in the field," she said, keeping her voice measured. "Trade relationships I built personally with Southern pack leaders. I believe the council should hear the reasoning behind my original proposals before—" "Selena," Kael's voice. "I have standing here." "I'm not debating your standing." He set down the document in his hands with the deliberate care of a man choosing patience as a weapon. "But this is not the time for personal presentations. The council is evaluating options." "When is the time? You've had my proposals for 6 weeks, and I've reviewed them." He met her eyes. "I have concerns." "What concerns? You didn't share any concerns 6 weeks ago." "I'm sharing them now." "In front of the full council and—" She stopped, looked at Marin, looked back at Kael, said the rest in a voice that didn't waver even though every part of her wanted to. "In front of someone whose role in this council has not been explained to me." Kael leaned back in his chair. She knew that posture. She knew everything about the way he held himself in rooms full of people. The slight drop of one shoulder, the way his chin lifted a fraction when he was done being challenged. She knew him the way you know something you've studied and loved and given yourself to without reservation. He said, "Bakwa, Marin is an advisor. She was brought in because I need counsel, that is—" He paused, and she watched him choose the word, "less compromised by personal investment." The room did not react. It was the reaction of a room that had been prepared for this sentence. "Personal investment," Selena repeated. "Your trade proposals benefit regions tied to your father's former territory." "I've noted that." "It's a natural bias, not a condemnation, but it limits your objectivity." "That is not true." Selena said, "That is not true, Kael. Those regions need the amendments. I went there. I saw it. You're using a justification that doesn't hold up to 3 minutes of scrutiny because—" "Enough." The word came down like a blade through wood, flat, final. "You're going to control yourself," Kael said, his voice low enough now that only the council table could hear it, which made it somehow worse, more intimate, as though the humiliation were something he was doing her the courtesy of keeping small. "Or you're going to leave this room. Those are the choices in front of you right now. I am your Luna. You are my Luna, and you are behaving like a jealous woman who came to my chamber last night and made accusations she couldn't support. And you are sitting in a council room letting that humiliation drive your objections rather than anything that resembles strategy." He looked at her with eyes that were not cold. Exactly. Cold would have been easier. They were tired, the eyes of a man who had decided the situation in advance and found the reality of it tedious. "I told you last night there were things you didn't understand. I was trying to protect you from having to navigate something complicated. This," a slight gesture at the room, "is what complicated looks like." She looked at the advisors. Cassian studied the table. 2 others found urgent business in their documents. Edric looked at her with something she might have called pity if she trusted any of them enough to accept pity from. She stood up. "I'll review the new framework," she said. To Kael, to the room. Not because she meant it, because it was the only sentence she could produce that didn't crack in the middle. Send it to my desk when it's finalized. She walked out. She made it to the far end of the corridor and stood against the wall with both hands pressed flat to the stone and breathed like a person who has come up from deep water and needs to remember how air works. She counted 11 seconds before she trusted her legs again. 11. Again. That number. She was going to have to figure out what it meant. 3 days passed, then 5, then 8. Selena learned what it meant to be made invisible in a place where your name was still spoken. The maids still curtsied. The guards still stood when she entered rooms. Her title was still used, her place at the evening table still set. And none of it meant anything because the actual substance of power, the councils she was excluded from, the messages routed around her, the decisions made and finalized before she heard so much as a rumor, had been stripped out from beneath the ceremony so gradually she couldn't have named exactly when it started. She started to name it now. She went to the archives, not the formal archives, the public records any PAC member could access, the older storage beneath the estate where correspondence was kept in bound leather portfolios that hadn't been indexed in decades. She lit a candle and sat on a cold stone floor and read. Marin's name first appeared 6 months ago. A border liaison from the Veyrath territories, the far northeastern holdings that had been in dispute with Kael's PAC for 3 generations. Selena read the correspondence 3 times. A border liaison did not have standing to enter a mate's sacred chamber. A border liaison did not advise on internal trade policy. A border liaison did not sit at an Alpha King's left hand in private council. She pulled more files. The Veyrath territories. She knew the name. Everyone in the northern PACs did. But only as a political abstraction, a place that generated disputes and occasional skirmishes and nothing worth sustained attention. What she found in the archive was not a political abstraction. It was a pattern. Correspondence between Kael's father and the Veyrath leadership, 30 years old, buried under 2 inches of dust about something referred to only as the Dusk Accord. She couldn't find the accord itself. She found the correspondence about it. She found the words that made something cold and specific settle in the base of her throat. A unification by force, if necessary, before the next Blood Moon gathering. The Blood Moon gathering was 11 weeks away. She closed the file carefully and put it back where she'd found it, and sat in the dark with the candle burning down between her fingers, and thought about what she knew and what she couldn't prove, and what would happen to her if she was wrong, and what would happen to everyone else if she was right. She thought about Kael's face in the council chamber, about the word compromised, about how easy it had been for him to slide that word into a sentence and watch it land. She thought about how you build a defense when the person running the prosecution is the same person who sleeps in your bed. She took nothing from the archive, memorized what she needed, went back upstairs into the light. The conversation with Nyla happened on the 9th day, in the small southern courtyard where Nyla came to smoke, which was a habit she maintained with absolute dignity and zero apology. Nyla Voss was Selena's cousin by blood and her only honest ear within the estate walls. She was also the PAC's appointed healer, which meant she had access to rooms and conversations that pure political standing wouldn't grant her. She was sharp-tongued and unsentimental, and she'd looked at Kael Draven with measured skepticism since the day Selena first brought her here, a fact Selena had once found irritating and now found clarifying. "How long have you known?" Selena said without preamble. Nyla exhaled smoke. "About Marin, or about the rest of it?" Selena sat down on the stone bench across from her. "Define the rest of it." "There are stories. I say stories because I'm a careful woman, and I don't repeat things I can't verify." Nyla turned to look at her directly. Her eyes were the same dark brown as Selena's, same jawline, different conclusions drawn from the same face. "But I've treated 3 PAC members in the last 2 months who came to me with what they described as anxiety. Sleep disruption, a sense of, and this is their word, not mine, wrongness. The kind of thing that presents in the body when something in the social structure of a PAC is off-center, and the wolves in it can feel it before they can name it. That's not nothing." "No." Nyla dropped the end of her smoke and stepped on it. "It's not nothing. It might also be a hard winter and PAC stress, and the ongoing border tensions and a dozen other things that have nothing to do with what you're looking for. She paused. What are you looking for? I'm looking for who Marin actually is. And what she's doing here, and who sent her. Selena pressed her palms together, the way she did when she was thinking something she hadn't finished thinking. There's a record in the lower archive about something called the Dusk Accord. Nyla's expression didn't change, which meant it changed completely, for someone who knew how to read her. You've heard of it, Selena said. My mother mentioned it once when I was 14, in the context of a warning. Told me there were old agreements between the Northern Pack leaders that had never been properly closed, the kind of unfinished business that comes back when someone with ambition decides the timing is right. Nyla looked at her. She told me to remember the name in case I ever needed it. I forgot it until right now. Selena let out a slow breath. The gathering is 11 weeks out. I know when the gathering is. If someone were planning to use it... Selena. Nyla's voice went quiet the way it went quiet in a sick room. Measured. Like someone who needed to say a hard thing and had decided how to say it. If you go to Kyle with this, and you're wrong, even slightly wrong, even if the core of it is right, but you can't prove the details, he will use it. You understand that. He'll use it to finish what he started in that council room. You'll go from difficult Luna to unstable Luna in a single conversation. I know. Do you? I know, Nyla. She looked at her hands. That's why I'm not going to him first. Then where? She didn't answer that yet. She was still building the answer in the place where answers live before they're spoken, that interior territory where she'd been doing most of her actual living for the last several months. She was thinking about 3 pack leaders she'd met personally during the trade amendment work. She was thinking about what it would take to reach them without the communication going through Kyle's channels. She was thinking about what she would say when she got there. She was thinking about what she was willing to lose. I need you to keep seeing patients, she said finally. I need you to keep your ears open. And I need you to tell me if anything changes with Marin. Where she goes, who she meets, anything that passes through your sick room that's attached to her in any way. You're going to go around him. I'm going to do what I can with what I have. Nyla looked at her for a long moment. Then she nodded once, short and settled. Don't get stupid about it, she said. Being right isn't worth anything if you can't stay standing. Odds. She got the message on the 14th day. It came through official channels, which was what made it grotesque. Written on estate stationery, sealed with Kyle's personal sigil, delivered by his steward to her door at the morning hour as though it were a trade directive or a schedule adjustment. Selena Voss, you are requested to cease independent communication with Southern Pack affiliates regarding internal trade matters. As these negotiations are now under the purview of council advisors, your direct contact constitutes interference. Please route any pack business through the appropriate channels. It was signed with Kyle's full title, not his name. His title. She read it twice. She folded it exactly in half. She set it on her desk beside the small leather journal from the Southern Trade Work, and she sat very still for a while. Please route any pack business through the appropriate channels. She had been the channel. That was what a Luna was. That was the job she'd done for 2 years without recognition and without complaint and with genuine belief that the work mattered. And he had taken the work and handed it to someone else and then written her a formal letter on estate stationery telling her she was now an obstruction to the thing she had built. The letter didn't break her. It clarified her. She opened the leather journal, found the page with the Northern contact. Not a Southern affiliate, a Northern one. A name she'd never shared with Kyle because it had come to her through Nyla's network, through the healer's quiet passage between territories, through channels that existed specifically because healers needed to move without political interference. An elder of the Ashvin Pack, 3 territories north, who had been a friend of Nyla's mother and who had sent 3 weeks ago a message through Nyla that Selena hadn't known what to do with. I have heard things. If the Luna of the Draven Pack is the listening kind, there is something she needs to know before the gathering. She'd been waiting to know whether she was the listening kind. She picked up a pen, and then the door to her chamber opened without a knock. Kale walked in with 2 of his council behind him, Cassian and the senior strategist, Ren, a man she'd spoken fewer than 20 words to in 2 years, and who had the flat, patient energy of someone who did dirty work with professional remove. Kale looked at the open journal on her desk, at the pen in her hand, at her face. "Put it down," he said. She didn't move. "I need you to understand something," he said, and his voice was the voice she hadn't heard since the first months, the voice that acknowledged her as a person in the room rather than a problem to be managed. It should have softened her. It didn't. "What you think you know, what you found in the archive, what you're doing with that journal right now, and it is more dangerous than you understand. And not for you, for this pack, for every wolf in these territories." "Then explain it to me," she said, "like I'm capable of understanding." "I'm trying. You wrote me a letter about appropriate channels." The words came out level and quiet and hit harder for it. "You wrote me a letter." He didn't flinch. "I need your communications controlled until after the gathering. It's not personal." "Everything about this is personal. This is political. There's a larger game in motion, and every move matters, and I need you to be silent," she said. "Say it plainly. To be controlled. Same thing." "No." He crossed the room and stopped close enough that she had to tilt her head to look at him, and hated that she still had to do that. Still had to rearrange herself to account for his size, his gravity, the way rooms bent around him. "It is not the same thing. I am asking you to trust that I am handling something that requires precision and that your involvement, however well-intentioned, will cost lives if it goes wrong." She looked at him for a long time. "I found you in the mate chamber," she said, "with your hand on another woman's face. I brought trade proposals to council, and you used them to call me biased in front of advisors I outrank by standing. I've been excluded from 12 council sessions I have documented right in standing to attend. I received a formal letter on estate stationery from my own mate asking me to route my work through appropriate channels." She watched his jaw tighten, watched him absorb each sentence the way something weathered absorbs rain. "And now you're in my room at first light with 2 of your men telling me that my involvement will cost lives and asking me to trust you." He said nothing. "I want to trust you," she said, and it was the most honest thing she'd said in 2 weeks, and she felt it like an open cut. "I have wanted nothing more than that. But trust goes both directions, and you have spent months giving me nothing to stand on and then acting surprised that I'm not standing where you need me. Selena, I'm not done." She held his eyes, didn't look at Cassian or Wren, just him. "I will give you 72 hours. Tell me what is happening. Tell me who Marin is and where she comes from and what the Dusk Accord is and why the Blood Moon Gathering has your people moving like there's a war coming. Tell me the truth and I will stand beside you the way I always have, and I will keep my communications quiet, and I will route my concerns through your appropriate channels." She set the pen down on the open journal. 72 hours. He looked at her, and she thought, she was almost certain, that in the half-second before his face closed again, she saw something that might have been remorse, something that might have been the man she'd married before the Alpha King swallowed him whole. Then he said, "I can't do that." And something in her finished breaking, quietly, without announcement. "Then I suppose," she said, "we understand each other." He left. Cassian left. Wren left, and at the door he paused and looked back at her with those flat professional eyes, and she saw in them the brief involuntary flicker of something a man like Wren would never say out loud. Not pity. Closer to recognition. The look of someone who has watched this exact moment before and knows what comes next. She waited until the door closed. Then she sat down at her desk, turned to a fresh page in the leather journal, and began to write the letter to the Ashvin elder. She was 3 sentences in when she heard, from somewhere in the estate above her, distant but distinct, carried by the mountain acoustics of the old stone building, Marin's voice, laughing, easy and unhurried, the laugh of someone who had been told they had nothing to worry about. Selena's hand kept moving across the page. She finished the letter. She folded it. She held it in both hands and breathed once, slow and total, the way you breathe before you go underwater or over a cliff or across the line between the life you had and the one you're going to have to build out of whatever survives. She thought about the archive, about the Dusk Accord, about 11 weeks and a blood moon gathering and a woman who laughed like someone who'd already won. She thought about 72 hours going unanswered. She thought about what it meant that Ren, Kael's executioner, in every sense that word carried, had paused at her door and looked at her like a man who knew what the next act of a play looked like before the curtain rose. And then Nyla's voice came through the chamber window, called up from the courtyard below, tight and stripped of its usual dry patience, the voice she used only when something had moved past the point of containment. "Selena." A beat. "They took your horses." She stared at the folded letter in her hands. Every horse in the Luna's stable, all 6, moved without her authorization, without notice, without the formal process that should have accompanied any transfer of the Luna's personal assets. The estate had just become a cage, and someone, Kael, or Marin, or both, or some machinery larger than either of them that she still didn't fully understand, had just slammed the door. They took the horses before sunrise. That was what she kept returning to, not as a wound, but as a data point. The decision had been made before Kael walked into her chamber. He'd come with Cassian and Ren already in position, the letter already sent, the stable order already executed. The conversation had not been a negotiation. It had been a notification dressed up as one. The 72 hours she'd offered him had been theater. He'd needed her to feel like she still had leverage so she wouldn't do anything drastic in the time it took him to finish closing the doors. She understood that now. Standing at the window above the empty southern courtyard, the letter to the Ashfen elder still folded in her hand, she understood that she had been handled, carefully, by someone who knew exactly how much room to give a person before pulling the rope tight. She also understood that he'd miscalculated, because the horses were gone, but Nyla wasn't. "Ichas, tell me exactly what you saw," Selena said. They were in the healer's room on the lower east corridor, the one place in the estate that operated under a different kind of law, the old convention that a healer's space was neutral ground, where pack rank went quiet and bodies told the truth without political interference. Nyla had maintained it as such, with the calm ferocity of someone who understood that the moment she let it become something else, she became something else. 4 of Kael's men, Nyla said. She was at her work table, hands moving through dried herbs she wasn't actually processing, the motion a cover for the stillness she was holding in everything else. Not stable hands. His men, armed, though they didn't draw. They led all 6 out through the western gate around the 4th hour. I watched from the upper window. "Did they see you watching?" "I didn't particularly hide." Neela's jaw shifted. "I'm the healer. I'm allowed to be awake at the 4th hour. I'm allowed to look out windows." "Did anyone come to explain it to you afterward?" "Nobody explains things to the healer. They just appear in my room with their problems later and hope I'll be useful." She set down the herbs, turned to look at Selena directly. "This is escalating faster than I thought it would." "Yes. The horses are the message. What's the actual threat underneath it?" Selena looked at the folded letter in her hand. "If I can't move freely and I can't communicate freely, I can't warn anyone about what I found in the archive. And if the gathering happens before anyone outside this estate knows what's being planned..." She stopped, made herself finish the sentence because unfinished sentences were a luxury she couldn't afford anymore. "Then whatever Marin's people are planning has a clear field." Nyla absorbed this. "The Ashfen elder. I need this letter out, through your channels, not mine. My channels aren't invisible. If they're watching me, are they?" Nyla thought about it, really thought. Not the kind of thinking that produces the answer you want. "Not yet. I'm peripheral. I'm useful, but I'm not the threat they're managing." A pause. "Yet. Then I need you to move before that changes." Nyla picked up the letter, turned it over once, didn't open it. "What am I carrying into, Selena? I need to know what this starts." "I don't know the full shape of it yet." The honesty cost her something, but she paid it. "I know there's an old accord between the Veyrath territories and the northern pacts. I know it involves force. I know the gathering is the timeline and Marin is the mechanism, and I know that Kael is either being used or he is using her, and I cannot tell you with certainty which one it is." She met Nyla's eyes. "What I can tell you is that the wolves outside this estate, the southern settlements, the border communities, the pacts that don't have stone walls and armed councils, they don't know anything, And if I'm right, they're about to be the cost of something they never agreed to. Nyla held the letter for a moment longer. Then she tucked it into the inner pocket of her healer's wrap. I'll go to the market district this afternoon. Medical supply run. I do it every 2 weeks. It won't flag. She moved back to her work table. You should not be seen doing anything different today. Go to the afternoon meal. Sit in your place. Be boring. I can do boring. You absolutely cannot, but try. Ma. The afternoon meal was a performance, and Selena gave it everything she had. She sat at her end of the table. She ate. She answered the 2 questions directed at her. One from a junior advisor about estate inventory she had no part in managing, one from the estate's domestic steward about a schedule adjustment she endorsed without opinion. She did not look at Marin, who sat at Kyle's left and ate with the comfortable appetite of someone who had decided the table was hers. She watched Kyle watch her. He was trying to read her the way he read everything. As a tactical situation, inputs and outputs, the angle of her shoulders and the pace of her eating and the frequency of her eye contact all being processed and measured against whatever model he'd built of her in his head. She gave him nothing. She'd spent 2 years learning his tells, and she understood, sitting there with her hands steady and her face arranged in the particular blankness of someone who has made peace with something, that he had spent 2 years learning hers. She was going to have to stop being readable. That was its own kind of violence. She had never once, in her life, tried not to be known. She had walked into rooms intending to be understood. She had built alliances on the principle that honesty given honestly was the most durable currency in a pack's economy. She had loved Cale Draven with the specificity of someone who believed that loving a person meant studying them until you knew where their wounds were, and then choosing never to use that knowledge as a weapon. She had handed him the map. He had used it. Fine. She would learn a different way to move through the world, not as punishment for him, as a survival mechanism for her. The woman who walked into rooms intending to be understood was going to get herself killed. She buried that woman quietly, between the soup course and the second plate, without ceremony. Cale's eyes were still on her when she set down her fork and rose from the table. "Forgive me," she said, to no one in particular. The phrasing of someone who expects no forgiveness and is not asking for any. "I have correspondence to see to." She was at the door when she heard Marin say, very quietly, to Kyle, "She's composing herself." And Kyle's response, quieter, "Let her. Let her." Third time she'd heard those 2 words from his mouth. Every time they meant something different, and all of them meant the same thing. That she was a variable he'd already solved for, her movements already accounted for in whatever calculation he was running. She did not break stride. She did not look back. She let the door close behind her, and she walked back to her chamber, and she sat at her desk, and she started thinking about the things they hadn't taken. Her name. Her standing under old law. Her knowledge of every Southern trade contact, memorized because she'd never trusted documents with information that mattered. And the 3 conversations she'd had 2 months ago with pack leaders outside Kyle's immediate orbit, Aldrich of the Greenfen, Soren of the Brackenhold, and a woman named Petra who led the Ashfin pack and whose elder had sent that message through Nyla's network. They'd taken her horses. They hadn't taken her memory. She picked up a pen and started writing. Not the letter. That was already with Nyla. This was different. This was the account she was building for herself, dated and precise, because precision was the only thing that survived a character assassination. Ren came to her door at the 8th hour. Not Kyle, not Cassian. Ren, which told her the nature of the visit before he opened his mouth. She let him in. She did not offer him a seat. He stood in the center of the room with his hands loose at his sides, the posture of a man who'd walked into uncomfortable rooms so many times it had stopped registering as uncomfortable. And he looked at her the way he'd looked at her in the council chamber doorway, with that flat professional recognition that she was beginning to understand was the closest Ren got to honesty. "The Alpha King wants to know if you've sent any correspondence today," he said. "Tell him I've been working on estate records." "That's not an answer to the question." "No," she agreed. "It isn't." Ren looked at her for a moment. Something shifted in his expression. Minor, the kind of thing you'd miss if you weren't watching for it. He's not wrong that there are things in motion you don't have the full picture of. Then give me the picture. That's not my call. Whose call is it? Right now? He paused. Marin's, mostly. The word landed in the room with weight that surprised her. Not because of what it said about Kyle, but because of what it said about Ren. Men like Ren did not give information away. Every syllable was calculated. He just handed her something he hadn't been sent to hand her. She looked at him carefully. Why are you telling me that? I'm not telling you anything. But he held her gaze a beat too long, and Ren was not a man who held eye contact by accident. I'm answering your question. Is Kyle making his own decisions? The Alpha King makes all final decisions. That's not what I asked. He looked at the floor, back at her. A man reviewing the distance between his loyalty and his conscience, measuring it in real time. There are advisors, he said finally, who have been advising for longer than this estate's current arrangement. Some things are further along than the Alpha King fully accounts for. She breathed slowly. Marin isn't reporting to Kyle. She's managing him. I'm answering your question. You're doing more than that. He didn't confirm it. He didn't deny it. He turned toward the door. At the threshold he stopped, the same hesitation as the council chamber, the pause of a man who has one more thing and is deciding whether the cost of saying it is one he can live with. The gathering date may shift, he said to the door. There's been talk of moving it forward by 3 weeks. If that happens, he stopped, started again. It would be useful to move before that happens. He left. Selena sat down on the bed with both hands on her knees and looked at the wall and let herself have exactly 30 seconds of something that wasn't composure. 30 seconds of her chest working too hard and her hands gripping her own kneecaps in the specific physical terror of a person who has just had the shape of a very large and very dangerous thing confirmed for her. Then she stood up. She went to the desk. She looked at what she'd written. 3 weeks shorter than 11 weeks was 8 weeks. 8 weeks to the gathering if the date held. Potentially 5 if it moved. She needed Nyla's letter to move tonight. She went to the window. The courtyard below was dark and empty, the stable block across it silent. 2 of Kyle's guards made their rotation at the southern corner. She watched their timing, not for the first time. 14 minutes between passes on the western side. 12 on the eastern. 12 minutes. Nyla left for the market district at the 3rd hour of afternoon. She would have already made contact by now, or she wouldn't. Selena was going to have to find out. She pulled on her dark outdoor wrap, not the Luna's formal cloak, the plain one she used when she walked the estate at night when she couldn't sleep, which she'd done often enough that no one flagged it anymore. And she opened her chamber door and she walked. Not to Nyla's room. Too direct. She went the long way, through the domestic wing, through the back kitchen corridor that smelled of old fires and rendered fat, out into the small herb garden that adjoined the healer's eastern window. She stopped beneath the window and looked up. The light was on. She picked up a small stone from the garden border and tapped it once against the stone sill. Waited. Tapped again. Nyla's face appeared at the glass. She looked down. Her expression was flat in the way that meant news. She held up 2 fingers. 2 contacts made. The letter had moved through 2 hands already. Then she held up 1 finger, pointed south. 1 response. Already. From the south. Selena stood in the dark herb garden with stone walls on 3 sides and felt something move through her that was not relief. Relief was too soft a word for what moved through her in that moment. It was closer to the feeling of solid ground under feet that had been walking on ice for a very long time. The crack and settle of something real. She pressed her palm once, flat, against the stone wall. A gesture that meant understood. That meant keep moving. That meant I know what this cost you, and I'm not forgetting it. Then she went back inside. Well, she was at her desk when Kyle came, past the 10th hour. No counsel behind him this time. No Cassian. He came alone, and he closed the door behind him, and he stood in the middle of her room and looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on his face in longer than she could precisely remember. Something undefended in it, something that hadn't been through the processor yet. She did not stand. She set down the pen. She waited. I know what Ren said to you. he said. Then you know more than I do, she said, because he was very careful. Kael's jaw shifted. He was out of line. He was honest with me. That hasn't been a standard practice around here lately. He crossed to the chair across from her desk, the one she used when she was doing correspondence and someone came to discuss it. He sat down, which was not something she'd expected, and he looked at her across the desk as though this were a different kind of meeting than any they'd had recently, something that predated Marin and the councils and the letter on estate stationery. I made decisions, he said, that I thought were protecting something larger than us. Tell me what you were protecting. He looked at his hands. The Veyrath territories have been building for 3 generations. That accord in the archive. My father negotiated the original version. The idea was a unified northern bloc. All the packs coordinated under a single leadership structure, strong enough that no outside force could move against us. That sounds like a justification for conquest. It's a justification for survival. His voice sharpened. You've seen what happens to isolated packs. The Greenfen territories lost 1/3 of their population to the eastern incursions 2 winters ago. The Brackenhold is down to 2 functioning settlements. We are fragmented and we are dying one piece at a time, and the Accord was supposed to fix that. By force, if necessary, she said. That's what was written. By force as a last resort. And Marin is the last resort. His eyes came up to hers, and for the first time in weeks, she saw something that was not management, or calculation, or controlled authority. Something that looked like a man who had made a very large bet and was only now beginning to understand what the losing side of it looked like. Marin is the Veyrath negotiator, he said. She was sent to finalize the terms. She's been... He stopped, started differently. What I did in the chamber was a mistake. Which part? The part you saw. He held her gaze. The rest of it. The accord, the strategy, the alliance structure. I stand by. But what you saw in the chamber shouldn't have happened, and the way I responded when you confronted me was wrong. Selena looked at him for a very long time, long enough that the fire in the grate had shifted from active burn to coal glow, and the room had gotten perceptibly colder. She was looking for the thing beneath the sentence, not what he was saying, but what he was asking, what he needed her to do at this moment, what function this conversation was supposed to serve. She found it. You need me to accept this, she said, so that I'll stop moving, so that I'll route my concerns through appropriate channels and sit at the table and not contact the Ashfen Elder or the Greenfen or anyone else outside your network. You need me settled so the gathering can proceed without the Luna of your pack complicating the terrain. His jaw tightened. I need you to trust me. I know, she said. I know you need that. She picked up her pen, looked at the page in front of her, looked back at him. I needed the same thing from you about 7 months ago. I needed it in the mate chamber, and I needed it in the council room, and I needed it when you wrote me a letter about appropriate channels instead of walking 20 feet down a hallway and talking to me like a person. She set the pen down again. You needed it from me, and I'm telling you the same thing you told me. She held his gaze. I can't give you that, she said. He sat with it. She watched him process the specific pain of being handed back what he'd handed her, the way you watch someone touch something hot and understand too late that it was hot because they'd made it that way. Then he stood. He straightened. The Alpha King re-entered the room, and whatever had been briefly, fractionally human in his face went back wherever it lived when it wasn't being used. Don't leave the estate grounds, he said. Or, don't make me answer that. She looked at him steadily. The gathering may be moving forward. His face didn't change, which was its own answer. You already knew, she said. You knew when you came in here. This was... She stopped, absorbed it. The conversation had been another notification dressed as a negotiation. He'd come to confirm that she was contained, to offer just enough openness to measure her response, to see how much she knew and how much she'd been told, and how far along the thing with Neela had gotten. He'd almost gotten it out of her. The fire snapped in the grate. Something in her chest went cold and clear and very, very quiet. Good night, Kael, she said. He left. She counted to 60 after the door closed. Then she went to the window. The courtyard was dark. The guards made their rotation at the southern corner. 14 minutes. 12. In her desk drawer was a second letter she hadn't told Nyla about, written before Wren's visit, addressed to Petra of the Ashvin Pact directly. Not through the Elder, not through intermediaries. A letter that named Marin, named the Veyrath territories, named the Dusk Accord and its timeline and the gathering and what she believed was coming for every pact that hadn't been brought inside Kael's coalition by consent. She pulled it out. She looked at it. Going around Kael was a line. Crossing it meant she could not come back inside the walls of this life and pretend she hadn't. She thought about the wolves in the Greenfen's 2 remaining settlements. She thought about the Brackenhold, down to 2 functioning communities, and shrinking. She thought about what it felt like to be the thing everyone else's strategy accounted for without consulting. She sealed the letter. She did not know yet how to get it out. But she would figure it out before morning, because the gathering was possibly 5 weeks away and the horses were gone and the doors were closing, and Wren had looked at her across a threshold with the eyes of a man who understood what the next act looked like before the curtain rose. She was not going to wait for the curtain. The letter was still in her hand when she heard Nyla scream. Not loud. That was the thing about Nyla. She was not a woman who screamed loudly. She was a woman who, when pushed to the point of screaming, produced something sharp and short, and immediately suppressed, the sound of someone who understood that noise was information, and information given freely was dangerous. One sound. Cut off. From the direction of the healer's corridor. Selena was moving before she'd consciously decided to move. She went through the back kitchen passage, the same route as before, and she was 8 steps from the healer's door when Cassian stepped out of the shadow beside the corridor arch and put one hand flat against the wall in front of her. Not touching her, just occupying the space. His face was doing nothing. That was how she knew it was bad. "The healer is fine," he said. "Move." "She's fine. She's being interviewed." The word interviewed in Cassian's mouth was a kind of admission. He would not have chosen that word if the alternative were something clean. Selena looked at him, at the line of his jaw, at the way his hand was pressed to the wall with more pressure than the gesture required. At the thing in his eyes that was not cruelty and was not indifference and was not quite guilt, but lived in the same neighborhood as all 3. "Cassian," she kept her voice low, controlled. "If you have a single thread of integrity left in you, you will move." He looked at her for a long moment, then he stepped aside. Not all the way. Enough. She pushed through the door. Nyla was seated in the chair at her work table, upright, both hands on the surface in front of her, and her chin elevated at the angle of someone who has decided that whatever is happening to them will not be read on their face. 2 of Kael's men stood at the edges of the room. Wren stood near the window, and Kael stood at the center, and he was looking at Selena as she came through the door with an expression she had no name for, something that had passed through anger and come out the other side into a territory she'd never seen on him before. On the table between Nyla's hands was the second letter, the one to Petra of the Ashvin Pact, the sealed one, the one Selena had written before Wren's visit and not told Nyla about. Selena looked at it, looked at Nyla. Nyla's eyes were steady, communicating 2 things simultaneously. "I didn't give it to them, and I don't know how they have it." Selena looked at Kael. "You searched my chamber," she said. "After our conversation." His voice was flat and very even. She recognized that evenness. It was the voice he used when he was managing something he was not yet sure he could manage. "You sat across from me and you talked about trust, and you had a second letter in your desk drawer the entire time, which you found by going through my desk, which I found because you are not as careful as you believe yourself to be." She crossed the room and picked up the letter. Neither of Kael's men moved to stop her. She felt the seal beneath her fingers still intact. They'd opened it and resealed it, or they hadn't opened it at all, and the fact that she couldn't tell told her they'd had practice. "This is addressed to Petra of the Ashvin Pact," Kael said, "the leader of a pact currently in active negotiation with the Veyrath territories." Selena went still. "Yes," he said, reading her face with the precision of 2 years of study. "Petra is not the ally you think she is. The Ashfin pack entered talks with Veyrath 6 months before Marin came here. Whatever you were planning to send her, you were sending it to the wrong side. The room reorganized itself around this information. She stood in the center of it and felt the specific vertigo of a plan built on a foundation that had just been removed. The stomach drop of realizing that the ground she'd been standing on was not ground at all. "The Elder," she said. "The message through Nyla's network." "Was bait," Kael said. "Yes." She looked at Nyla. Nyla's jaw was tight. The message they'd both believed was an opening. The Elder's careful "I have heard things" had been a line cast into water they'd thought was safe. "You used your own pack's healer network," Selena said, and something in her voice had changed without her choosing to change it. Something had stripped away that went below composure and below anger into a register she'd never operated in before. Something cold and specific and entirely without sentiment. "You ran an operation through the one channel in this estate that is supposed to be neutral ground. I protected. You compromised a healer." She looked at the two men at the edges of the room, at Ren by the window who was studying the floor. "You sat across from me an hour ago and talked about trust, and you had men in this room before I got back to my desk. You were sending intelligence to the enemy. I was trying to warn people. You were about to hand a strategic assessment of my pack's internal situation to a pack leader who is coordinating with Veyrath." His voice cracked, slightly, on the last word, not with emotion, with the strain of a man holding a very large weight. "Do you understand what that would have done? To every wolf inside these walls?" She understood. She did understand that fully and without argument, the letter would have been worse than useless. It would have been a gift. She held that understanding in one hand, and in the other hand she held what it meant that the network she'd trusted, the Elder's message, the channel she'd believed was safe, had been manufactured to catch her specifically. Someone had built a trap that required knowing exactly how she thought, exactly which instincts to bait, exactly what kind of appeal would make Selena Voss extend her hand into dark water. "Who built it?" she said. "The trap with the Ashfin Elder. Who built it?" Kael didn't answer. She looked at Marin's absence in the room and understood that Marin's absence was itself an answer. "She knew what I'd do," Selena said. "She's been watching me long enough to know what I'd do." She looked at Kael. "How long has she been here? Not how long since you brought her in through official channels. How long has she actually been inside your information?" His silence was the longest one yet. "Kael." 18 months, he said. 18 months. 2 months before Selena had presented the trade amendments. 4 months before the council session, where her proposals had been displaced. 8 months before she'd started waking at midnight to find his side of the bed cold. She'd been operating inside a situation that was 18 months old, and had believed for most of that time that she was responding to something new. She sat down. Not because she chose to, because her legs made a unilateral decision. "You need to stop," Kael said, and for the first time he sounded tired in a way that wasn't strategy, genuinely worn down, the fatigue of a man who had been managing too many things for too long and could see the cost accumulating. "I need you to understand that I am trying to hold together something that was already in pieces when I inherited it, and that every move I make has consequences I cannot fully protect you from if you keep moving against me. I'm not moving against you. The letter, I was moving for the people who don't have stone walls." She looked up at him. "That's all I was ever doing. That's all I've ever done since I came to this estate. And you have spent 18 months letting someone who does not know these people, who has never sat in their homes or learned their names, tell you what to do with them. Marin is not... She built a trap using your pack's healer network," Selena said. "She used the one channel in this estate that operates under old law. She did that from inside your confidence, with your resources, without your complete knowledge. And you're still in this room defending the arrangement." She looked at him with something that was not anger, because anger required fuel, and she was running on something colder and more durable. "When does it stop being an alliance and start being a leash?" The two men at the edge of the room had stopped pretending to look at anything else. Ren still studied the floor, but his jaw had moved. Cassian, in the doorway, had both hands at his sides. Kael looked at her for a long time. Then he said, "You're confined to the East Wing until after the gathering. Your correspondence will be reviewed. Nyla will continue her duties under observation." He paused. "I'm sorry it came to this." "No," she said. "You're not." He left. The men filed out. Ren paused at the door. The same threshold pause, the third time now, the gesture of a man collecting something he keeps, nearly saying, and then he too was gone. Cassian was last. He stood in the doorway for a moment with his hand on the frame, and he looked at Nyla's hands on the table, and then at Selena's face, and then at something in the middle distance that had nothing to do with either of them, and he said very quietly and with no inflection at all, "The gathering moved. 3 weeks from today." Then he walked out and pulled the door shut behind him. 3 weeks! Selena sat across from Nyla in the healer's room with the remains of a failed plan between them on the table and did not speak for a long time. Nyla poured water from the jug at her station and set a cup in front of Selena and one in front of herself, and neither of them drank. 18 months, Nyla said finally. "Yes." "She was inside his information before you finished the trade proposal work." "Before I started it, probably." Nyla looked at her cup. "The 2 contacts I made today? Through my network." "Compromised," Selena said. "Possibly. We have to assume everything that moved through the Ashvin connection is contaminated." "That's almost everything I moved." "I know." Nyla was quiet for a moment. Then, "What do we actually have left?" Selena turned the sealed letter over in her hands, the one addressed to the wrong person, the one that had nearly handed their position to the opposition, the one she'd written by hand in her own room, believing herself careful. She thought about what it contained. The names, the timeline, the Dusk Accord, the Veyrath connection, everything she'd assembled from the archive and from Ren's half-sentences and from 2 years of living inside a situation that had never been what it looked like from the outside. "The information is still real," she said. "Marin is still who she is. The Accord is still what it is. Kyle is still operating inside something he doesn't fully control." She set the letter down. "Trapping me doesn't make any of that false." "It makes you impossible to believe." Nyla looked at her steadily. "You understand that. A confined Luna, stripped of her horse, caught trying to send unauthorized correspondence to a compromised contact. If you tried to speak at the gathering, you'd be the unstable woman Kael's been managing. That's the whole architecture of it. They don't need to silence you outright. They just need the room to already have a story about you before you open your mouth." Selena knew. She'd known it since the council room, since the word jealous had landed in her chest like a stone into still water, the ripples spreading outward in ways she hadn't fully mapped until now. They hadn't needed to destroy her. They'd needed to make her already destroyed in the perception of everyone who mattered. Every public dismissal, every formal letter, every redirection through appropriate channels had been a brushstroke in a portrait she hadn't realized was being painted. She looked at her hands. They were steady. That surprised her. The rest of her felt like something after an earthquake. The shaking done, the landscape changed, the new topography requiring entirely different navigation than what she'd learned on the old ground. "I need to get out," she said. Nyla did not ask where, did not ask how. "When?" "Tonight is impossible. They'll have the East Wing watched now." She thought through the estate's geography with the attention she'd been quietly giving it for 6 weeks, cataloging it the way you catalog a place you suspect you might need to leave in a hurry. "The Market District run. You go every 2 weeks. They'll have someone with me now." "One person?" Nyla considered. "Probably. I'm low threat. They don't want to disrupt the medical function. The estate needs the healer to keep moving. One person can be managed." Selena met her eyes. Not confronted. Managed. "You've been moving through this estate for 3 years without anyone thinking twice about where you go or why. That doesn't change overnight." "I go to market in 5 days." 5 days? 3 weeks to the gathering minus 5 days of confinement, minus the travel time to reach anyone who was not already inside Marin's network. She ran the arithmetic, and it came out tight and unforgiving and the only kind of possible that requires every single thing to go right. There's one contact I never put in writing, she said. Never mentioned to you, never mentioned to anyone. She thought about Aldrich of the Greenfen, not the Greenfen leader she'd met through the trade work, but his younger brother, a man named Corin, who ran his pack's eastern border operations, and who had looked at her over a trading post table 8 months ago with the specific attention of someone who understood that what was said in official meetings was not the same as what was true. He'd pressed a coin into her hand when they parted. A Greenfen border marker, the kind the Eastern Scouts used as identification. She'd kept it in the lining of her outdoor wrap because she hadn't known why yet. Now she did. I need to reach him without anything written down. A verbal message. Through your network. Not the Ashvin channel, the old one. Your mother's contacts. Nyla went very still. Those are private. I know. My mother built those over 30 years. They predate every political arrangement in the current. I know, Nyla. She held her cousin's gaze. I am asking you to spend the thing you've been keeping in reserve. I'm asking because I don't have anything left that isn't already burned. And because 3 weeks from today, something happens at the gathering that I cannot stop from inside an East Wing with watched correspondence and no horses. She paused. But you can say no. This is your network, your inheritance. I am asking, not telling. Nyla looked at the water in her cup, the fire in the grate, the door to the corridor. She said, "What's the message?" The East Wing confinement lasted 4 days before Selena understood the shape of her own captivity well enough to move inside it. She was not locked in. The doors opened. She could walk the east corridor, the adjoining garden, the small reading room at the corridor's end. What she could not do was reach the western or southern wings where the councils met, the main gate, or any of the estate's external communication channels. 2 guards rotated outside her chamber door. One followed her at a fixed distance whenever she left it. She spent 2 days appearing to accept this, appearing to be exactly what Kyle had built a story about, a woman who had exhausted herself, who had recognized the futility of her position, who was resting. She was not resting. She was counting. Learning names, learning the shift rotations, learning that the guard who followed her at distance on the 3rd-hour rotation was a young man named Breck, who had served under her direct authority for 11 months before the council restructuring, and who, when she said good morning to him on the 2nd day, looked at the floor with the expression of someone who had a very clear conscience and was not enjoying what he was being asked to do with it. On the 4th evening, she stopped in the corridor on her walk and turned to face him. "Breck," she said. He stood at his fixed distance. "Luna Voss. How long have you been doing this rotation?" 4 days, Luna. "Do you know why you were assigned to it?" A pause. "I was told it was a precaution during a sensitive political period. And do you find that explanation sufficient?" He looked at her. He was 23 years old and he had a sister in the southern settlements. And he'd told Selena about her once, during a routine escort 2 years ago, with the proud, careful love of a young man who has one person in the world he's sure about. She'd remembered it because that was what she did. She remembered the things people told her about the people they loved, because those were the true things, the things beneath the rank and the title and the political arrangement, the things that told you who someone actually was. "No, Luna," he said quietly. "I don't." She looked at him for a moment. "I'm going to ask you something, and I need you to understand that it is a request, not an order. You don't have to do anything you don't choose to do." He waited. "In 3 days, Nyla goes to the market district. I need you to be the one who goes with her." His eyes moved, processing. "I'm assigned to the East Wing." "Assignments change. You can request a rotation adjustment based on operational need. You're senior enough." She kept her voice level. Not pleading, not commanding, something in between, the register of one person speaking honestly to another inside a situation that neither of them had chosen. "I'm not asking you to do anything that compromises your post. I'm asking you to be present on that specific run. That's all." He stood very still. "Breck," she said. "The sister in the southern settlement, what is her name?" His jaw worked. "Lena," he said. "If I'm right about what's coming," she said, "Lena needs someone to know the truth before the gathering. That's what I'm trying to do. Not damage this pack, not compromise Kale's position. Get the truth in front of people who can act on it before it's too late to act. She held his gaze. If I'm wrong, nothing happens, and you made a routine schedule request. That's the entire exposure. He looked down the corridor, back at her. I'll put in the request, he said, in the morning. She nodded once, turned and walked back toward her chamber. Behind her, his footsteps resumed at their fixed following distance, steady and unchanged, the posture of a guard doing his job. She went into her room. She sat at the desk. She opened the leather journal and turned to a blank page, and she began to write everything. Not a letter, not correspondence, not anything that could be used against her as communication. An account. Dated, precise. In her own hand. The kind of thing that lived inside a book and could not be called a message, and could not be intercepted in transit because it never moved until she moved with it. She wrote until the fire burned to coals. She wrote the name Marin, and the name Veyrath, and the name Dusk Accord, and the timeline and the gathering, and the 18 months and the healer's network, and the letter to the wrong Ashvin contact, and Wren's 3 pauses and 3 doorways. And she wrote what Cassian had told her as he left. 3 weeks to the gathering, now reduced to less. And she wrote the name Corin of the Greenfen and the coin in the lining of her wrap, and the message Nyla was carrying through the old network into territory that had never been mapped into anyone's political calculation. And at the bottom of the last page, she wrote the thing she'd been avoiding writing since the night she found Kyle in the mate chamber, the thing that lived underneath all the strategy and all the intelligence work and all the careful counting of guard rotations and shift schedules. She wrote, I don't know if he's a man who made a catastrophic mistake or a man who was never who I thought he was. I don't know which of those is worse to be true. I know it doesn't matter anymore. I know the only question left is what I do with what I know, and how many people I can keep alive in the doing of it. She closed the journal. She looked at the dark window, the empty courtyard below, the stable block across it still silent, still without her horses. She thought about what Nyla had said, the architecture of it, the portrait being painted before she opened her mouth. The only way to dismantle a portrait was to be somewhere the painter wasn't, to stand in a room where the story hadn't arrived yet and speak before it got there. To be, just once, ahead of it, 3 weeks, less now. And the young guard putting in a rotation request in the morning and an old network moving through channels no one had thought to contaminate, and a coin in the lining of her wrap, and everything else burned down to this. She was going to have to become someone she'd never been, not harder, not colder, something more difficult than either, someone who could be both, who could hold warmth and ruthlessness in the same hand without letting one cancel the other, who could grieve what she'd lost and move through the grief without stopping in it. She had never known how to be that person. She was going to learn in 3 weeks, or she was not going to get the chance to learn anything. The fire went out in the grate. She sat in the dark, and she was not afraid. That surprised her most of all. Not the absence of grief. The grief was there. It would always be there. The shape of what she'd believed and lost was not something that resolved cleanly, but beneath it and around it and somehow through it was something that had no softness in it at all, something that felt like the ground after the earthquake, changed and hard and entirely capable of holding weight. She put her hand flat on the cover of the journal. She was ready. And then the door opened, not with a knock, not with warning, and Wren walked in, and his face was doing something it had never done in all 3 of the threshold pauses, all the careful half-sentences. It was doing something uncontrolled, something that looked, on a face built for professional remove, exactly like fear. They found the journal, he said, the one in Nyla's room, the original network contacts, all of it. He stopped, drew breath. Marin has it. She's presenting it to Kale in the morning as evidence of coordinated subversion. He looked at her with those flat eyes gone suddenly and entirely unflat. If you're going to move, it has to be tonight. Not because she'd planned for 11 minutes, because that was what Wren gave her when he stepped back into the corridor and pulled the door to her chamber shut and resumed his position, and because 11 minutes was the gap in the Eastern Guard rotation she'd been counting for 4 days, and because some numbers she was beginning to understand were not coincidences. They were the shape of a life trying to tell you something. She moved without lighting a candle. She knew her room in the dark the way you know a place you've been trapped in. Every corner, every surface, the exact distance between the desk and the door. She pulled on the plain outdoor wrap. She took the leather journal from the desk and pressed it flat against her body beneath the wrap. She took the coin from the lining pocket, Corin's green fen border marker, cold and small in her fist, and she held it the way you hold something that is the last piece of a plan and also the first piece of whatever comes next. She did not take anything else. She had learned in the last 3 weeks the difference between what she needed and what she'd believed she couldn't survive without. The distance between those two things was significant. She opened the door. The corridor was empty in the way corridors are empty between rotations. Not safe, just unoccupied for a measured interval. She moved east, away from the main wing, toward the small garden that adjoined Nyla's window. She did not run. Running was information. She walked at the pace of a woman who could not sleep and had given up pretending otherwise. Nyla was already at the window. Not waiting. Nyla didn't wait. She worked. She was doing something with her hands at the workbench even in the dark, but her body was angled toward the glass in the way of someone who had been listening for footsteps. When Selena appeared in the garden below, she raised one hand. Not a wave. A signal. She held up 3 fingers, lowered 2. 1 finger remaining, pointing north. 1 contact from the old network. North. Already moving. Corin of the Green Fen. The message had reached him. Selena pressed her palm flat against the stone wall. Then she pointed at Nyla and then at herself and held her hands together. Nyla shook her head, short, decisive. The gesture of someone who had already weighed this and arrived at an answer she wasn't going to revisit. She was telling Selena to go alone. Selena understood it. Nyla, as the estate's healer, compromised and watched but still functional, was worth more than Nyla as a fugitive. The network still had threads that hadn't been pulled yet. Nyla in place was a resource. Nyla running was just another person in the dark. Selena pressed her palm to the wall one more time. It meant, I know. It meant, I won't forget. It meant the particular thing that words between people who know each other deeply can compress into a gesture. Thank you. Be careful. I'm sorry this cost you what it cost you. Then she moved toward the western garden wall. Try it. The wall was 12 feet of old stone with an iron drainage pipe running along its eastern face that she had looked at every single time she'd walked the garden for 6 days. The pipe was original to the estate, older than the current drainage system, redundant now, fixed to the wall with iron brackets that had oxidized into something between rust and permanence. She grabbed the lowest bracket with both hands and pulled her weight off the ground and felt the bracket hold and began to climb. Her arms knew the work, even if they'd never done this specific thing. She'd spent 2 years building and riding and moving through territory that required a body kept functional, and she was grateful for that now, in a way that had nothing abstract about it. Pure physical gratitude, the kind that lives in muscle and not in thought. She went up the pipe hand over hand, 12 feet of cold stone against her face, and the night air already colder outside the estate walls. And she came over the top and dropped to the other side and landed hard and absorbed it in her knees and moved before the impact had finished registering. She was out. The road north of the estate curved through timber before opening onto the high territory that connected to the Green Fen border runs. She moved into the timber immediately, off the road, navigating by the inclination of the ground and the sound of the creek that ran parallel to the eastern path. She had no horse. She had the coin. She had the journal pressed against her ribs and the cold in 11 minutes that had already expired and whatever came after 11 minutes. She ran. Guts. She heard him before she saw him. The low signal whistle, 2 notes, the Green Fen border scout's call that Corin had described to her once at the trading post table as though describing something she'd never need to know. She'd stored it anyway because that was what she did. She answered with the only thing she had, which was silence and stillness. And 3 seconds later, Corin of the Green Fen stepped out from between 2 pines with the pack horses at his shoulder, and his face carrying the particular expression of a man who has ridden hard in the dark to honor a message he wasn't certain was genuine. He looked at her, at the plain wrap, at the fact that she was breathing hard and alone. "You actually got out," he said. "You actually came," she said. He handed her the reins of the second horse without ceremony. She took them. That was the whole negotiation. They rode north for 2 hours before either of them spoke substantively. She told him what she knew: the archive, the Accord, Marin, the gathering's new date, the Ashfen contamination, the journal Marin now possessed and would be presenting to Kyle at morning. He listened in the manner of a man who is taking inventory, not evaluating, storing everything before he begins to assess. When she finished, he said, "My brother knows some of this." "Which parts?" "The Veyrath movements. We've had border scouts tracking unusual troop positioning for 8 weeks. Didn't know the gathering was the trigger." He looked at her across the horses in the dark. "The Ashfin situation. That's a problem. If Petra's in Veyrath's camp and she has your intelligence assessment, then they know I'm not contained anymore. She'd been running that logic since the timber. They'll know I got out. Marin will know the morning journal presentation is redundant, which means they accelerate." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "The gathering is in 3 weeks. Less, possibly." Kale was told 3 weeks. Marin's people may have a different number. Corin thought about this in the way his brother thought about things. The Greenfen men had a particular quality of stillness when they were processing danger, something that looked like calm from the outside and was nothing like calm on the inside. "There's a convening point," he said finally. "The old border marker station at Herath Ridge. Neutral ground, predates all current pack arrangements. If we sent word tonight to every pack leader who isn't already in Veyrath's pocket, called an emergency assembly before the gathering, they'd come? If they understood the alternative? Yes." He looked at her. "They'd need to hear it from you, not from me, not from Aldrich, not from a message. From you. In person, with everything you have documented." She thought about the journal against her ribs, about how much of what she'd written could be verified against records that still existed in the estate archive. The correspondence files she'd photographed in her memory because the originals couldn't be moved. About what it meant to walk into a room of pack leaders as a woman who had been publicly labeled unstable, whose Luna standing was technically still intact under old law, but whose credibility had been systematically dismantled over 18 months. About whether any of that mattered if the alternative was 3 weeks of silence while Marin's people positioned for a blood moon assault. "How long to reach Herath Ridge?" she said. "Riding hard? 2 days. And to get word to the pack leaders? My brother has riders." He said it with the flat confidence of someone who has already been thinking about the logistics for longer than the conversation. "He's been waiting for a reason to move on this. We needed someone who could stand in that room withstanding." She looked at the dark road ahead. 2 days riding. Pack leaders who would look at her and see everything Kael's machinery had made of her over the last 18 months. An old border station on neutral ground, and whatever she could build in a room from the wreckage of a plan that had already burned twice. She thought about what Nyla had said, the portrait being painted before she opened her mouth. The only way to dismantle it was to be somewhere the painter wasn't, to speak before the story got there. "Send the riders," she said. Herath Ridge was 3 walls and a roof and a fire pit that hadn't been used in years, and 6 pack leaders who had ridden through 2 days of autumn cold to stand in it and look at her with expressions ranging from cautious to openly skeptical. Aldrich of the Greenfen stood at his brother's side. Soren of the Brackenhold she recognized from the trade visits. He looked at her with the wariness of a man who had heard things and was deciding how much of what he'd heard was true. 3 others whose names she matched to faces from Corin's briefings on the ride, representatives of packs along the northern and eastern corridors who had been watching the Veyrath movements from the outside and hadn't had a name to put to them yet. She put the journal on the table. She didn't open with apology. She didn't open with context. She said, "Marin of the Veyrath territories has been operating inside the Draven Pack's inner council for 18 months. She has positioned herself to control the Alpha King's strategic decisions ahead of the Blood Moon gathering. The goal is unification of the northern territories under Veyrath leadership, by force, against any pack that doesn't consent. The gathering is the assembly point. The timing is deliberate. Every northern pack leader in one place, one night, one strike." The room was quiet. Soren said, "You're the Luna Draven has been managing. I'm the Luna who found out why he was managing me." She opened the journal to the Dusk Accord pages. "These are my notes from the estate archive. The original correspondence is still there. I have location details specific enough that anyone you send can verify independently. She looked around the table. I know what I look like coming in here. I know the story that's been told about me. I'm telling you that the story was told specifically to prevent this conversation from happening, and the fact that it almost worked should concern you more than whether you trust me. An older man, Heron of the Eastern Pack, she placed the name, leaned forward. If the Alpha King is compromised, why are we not going to him directly? Because we don't know yet how deep it goes. She held his gaze. Kyle Draven may be a man being used by someone smarter than him, or he may be a man who made a calculation about what unification was worth and is now too far in to walk it back. Until we know which one, going to him directly hands our position to the wrong side of that question. And if we do nothing, Soren said. 3 weeks. The gathering. Every pack leader in the Northern Territories in one location on the night of maximum symbolic authority, with Veyrath forces positioned at the borders and Marin inside the proceedings with 18 months of intelligence on every vulnerability you have. She let that land. That's the shape of doing nothing. The room absorbed it. She watched faces move through the work of believing something they hadn't wanted to need to believe. The specific labor of accepting that the world has changed its shape while you were managing the shape you already knew. Aldrich spoke. What do you need from us? Riders to the packs not represented here. A coordinated presence at the gathering that Marin's people won't have accounted for because their intelligence on all of you is filtered through channels I've now identified. And someone with legal standing to invoke the old assembly laws. The ones that require full pack consensus before any unification agreement can be binding. That would have to be a Luna, Heron said. Under old law. She looked at him. Or an Alpha who invokes it on behalf of another pack's Luna, he continued carefully, which requires that Luna to still hold standing. My standing under old law was never formally stripped, she said. Kyle confined me. He didn't challenge my standing in open assembly. He couldn't. A formal challenge would have required bringing the evidence against me in front of the full council under old law procedures, and the evidence they had wasn't enough to survive that scrutiny. Heron looked at his hands, at the journal, at her. You've thought this through. I've had time. The assembly took 40 minutes. When it was done, she had 6 riders going out that night, a coordinated plan for pack presence at the gathering that would not look coordinated from the outside, and Aldrich's formal invocation of the old assembly laws filed with 2 witness signatures on a document that now lived in Corin's saddlebag. She walked out of Veyrath Ridge into cold air and stood with her hands at her sides and breathed for the first time in what felt like days without the specific pressure of walls around her. So, she had 10 days before the gathering. She used them the way she'd learned to use everything, carefully, without waste, with the understanding that every resource was finite and the only currency that renewed itself was clarity about what she was doing and why. She did not stay in one place. She moved with Corin through the eastern border territories, meeting in person with 3 pack leaders who hadn't been at Veyrath Ridge, sitting in kitchens and border posts and twice in the open under pine trees because there was no building available that felt safe enough. And she told the same story 11 times, and each time it was more precise and more documented and more undeniable. She thought about Kyle during those days. She thought about him the way you think about a wound that is healing. You don't stop being aware of it. You don't pretend it isn't there. But you stop organizing your movements around protecting it and start organizing them around using the leg. She thought about the man she'd found in the mate chamber and about the man who had sat across her desk at the 10th hour and said, I'm sorry it came to this. And she held both of those men in her mind without resolving them into a single coherent person, because they weren't a single coherent person, and pretending otherwise was a luxury she'd already paid the price for. What she didn't do was hate him. There wasn't room for hate. Hate was heavy, and she was traveling light. On the 8th day, Corin brought her news from inside the estate. Nyla was still in place, still functioning. They hadn't moved against her, which told Selena they still needed the healer, which told her the estate was experiencing exactly the kind of internal fracturing that happened when the machinery of a well-run operation lost a key component and started compensating in ways that strained everything else. Ren had not been seen in the main council for 4 days. Cassian had made an unauthorized exit from the estate on the 6th morning and had not been accounted for since. And Kael, according to the source Corin wouldn't identify but whose access was clearly close, had not slept in 3 days. She absorbed that, filed it, moved on. On the night before the gathering, she sat alone by the fire in the border outpost where she'd spent the last 2 nights. And she looked at the journal in her lap, and she understood that she had done everything she could do in the time she'd had, and that what came next was not something she could fully control, and that this specific point, standing at the edge of an action whose outcome wasn't guaranteed, was the place where most plans failed. Not because the intelligence was wrong or the preparation was insufficient, because the human beings executing the plan hit the moment of genuine uncertainty and flinched. She did not flinch. She sat with the uncertainty the way you sit with weather, not fighting it, not pretending it wasn't there, just present inside it and still moving. She closed the journal. She put the green fen coin back in her pocket. She pulled on the plain outdoor wrap. She thought about the sacred chamber and the orange light through the gap in the door and the expression on Kyle's face the half-second before it closed, the thing that might have been remorse. She thought about all the ways that moment could have gone differently if either of them had been different people. She let herself have that thought completely, and then she let it go, because the people they had been were not the people they were now, and the people they were now had a gathering to get to. The Blood Moon gathering convened at the Veyrath Valley Assembly Grounds, the same neutral territory the old packs had used for 3 generations, flat ground ringed by torchlight with a central dais where the presiding alpha stood to open proceedings. Selena arrived with Corin and 4 of the Green Fen border riders before the first torch was lit, in the gray pre-dawn when the ground was still wet with night, and she took a position in the eastern approach where she could see the full grounds without being visible from the main processional. She watched the packs arrive. She watched Kael arrive. He came with his full council. Cassian, notably, was absent, and the absence was visible as a gap in a formation that should have been complete. Marin rode at his left. She was dressed for authority, not for border work, something formal and deliberate in the cut of her clothing that said, "This is a person who arrived at this day, having expected it for a long time." She moved with the ease of someone stepping onto ground they'd already claimed in their mind. Selena watched her scan the assembly grounds, watched her eyes move through the gathered packs, doing the same calculation Selena had done. Who is here? Who is missing? What does the configuration mean? She watched the moment Marin's eyes found the Green Fen contingent, found the Brackenhold, found the eastern packs that hadn't been on her intelligence map because Selena's network had never touched theirs. Watched the calculation in her face shift from confidence to something adjacent to recalibration. Not panic. A woman like Marin didn't panic. But the specific contained tension of someone who has discovered the terrain is not what the map said. Selena stepped out from the eastern approach and walked onto the assembly grounds. She heard it happen around her. The ripple of recognition, pack members noticing and turning, the information moving through the gathered crowd like weather through trees. She walked toward the central dais at a pace that communicated exactly nothing except the specific authority of a woman who had decided she belonged where she was going. She heard Kael's voice from 30 feet away, sharp and controlled, the command register. "Selena." She kept walking. "Selena." Closer now. He'd moved. She heard it. "Stop!" She stopped. But she stopped at the base of the dais steps, not because he'd commanded it, but because the dais was where she was going and she had arrived. She turned to face him. He was 10 feet from her, and he looked like a man who had not slept in 3 days, which meant the source had been right, and beneath the sleeplessness was something else. Something she hadn't seen before. Not anger, not calculation, not the managed authority of the Alpha King running a proceeding. He looked like someone who had realized mid-step that the ground was not where his foot expected it to be. Marin was behind his left shoulder. Her eyes were moving through the assembly grounds, still cataloging, still assessing. Selena watched her find the faces she hadn't known would be there. Watched her find Heron of the Eastern Pack, who was old law and knew it. Watched her find Soren of the Brackenhold, who was watching Marin with the flat attention of a man who has been told a specific story about a specific person and is now looking at that person and finding the story fits. Kael looked at Selena's face, at the journal in her hand, at the assembly around them, which was very quiet, in the way that assemblies get quiet when they understand they are watching something that matters. "You can't do this," he said. "I invoke the old assembly right," she said, loud enough to carry. "Luna's standing, uncontested, full pack witness, full record." She held up the journal. "I have documentation of a coordinated action against the integrity of this assembly and the sovereignty of every pack represented here. I am requesting the floor." The silence was absolute. She watched Marin's hand move, a small movement, a signal, the gesture of someone directing something to begin. And from the northern approach to the assembly grounds came the sound, low and building, of riders arriving in numbers that had not been accounted for in any preparation for a peaceful gathering. Veyrath forces. Not waiting for the proceedings to conclude. Coming now, because the proceedings were already lost and the only play left was the one Marin had held in reserve from the beginning. Kael turned and saw what Selena had already seen. In the firelight, his face went through the same three expressions she'd watched in the mate chamber: surprise, calculation, something beyond both of them. But this time the third expression was not cold and closed. It was the open, unguarded face of a man who has just understood, completely and too late, what he built and what it cost, and what is standing 10 feet away from him that he cannot get back. She looked at him. 1 second. 2. Then she looked at the northern approach, at the riders coming through the torchlight. And she looked at the 600 wolves gathered on these grounds in all directions. And she looked at the journal in her hand. She had one move, one window. Marin's forces were 60 seconds from the assembly perimeter, and whatever she was going to do had to be done before they arrived and changed the nature of what this ground was. She put her foot on the first step of the dais. She took the second step before the first one had finished meaning anything. The dais was 7 steps total. She had counted them from the eastern approach in the pre-dawn gray, the way she counted everything now, the way survival had reorganized her mind into a thing that measured distances and timing before it measured anything else. 600 wolves on this ground, 60 seconds before Veyrath riders reached the perimeter. 7 steps to the place where the presiding voice of an assembly stood under old law, and whoever stood there first owned the next 60 seconds. She took the steps the way she'd climbed the estate wall, without ceremony, without announcement, hand and foot, and the full commitment of a body that had decided. She reached the top and turned and opened the journal and said, in a voice she aimed at every corner of the assembly grounds simultaneously, "My name is Selena Voss, Luna of the Draven Pack under old law, standing unchallenged. I invoke witness right. What is said from this ground in the next 60 seconds is pack record, permanent, unalterable. Every alpha here is bound by it." The old law invocation worked the way old law always worked, not because anyone had agreed to it tonight, but because it predated anyone's agreement and everyone in that assembly knew it. She watched it move through the crowd, watched alphas straighten involuntarily, the body's response to law that lived in the bones of this culture older than any of them. Marin's voice came sharp from Kael's left. "She has no authority here. She is a confined—" "She invoked witness right from the dais," Heron of the Eastern Pack said, loudly, clearly, the voice of a man who had been waiting for exactly this procedural moment and was not going to let it pass unchallenged, under old law that supersedes confinement orders. Every pack leader here knows it. The northern approach riders had reached the outer torchlight. Selena could see them without looking directly. Peripheral, present, the specific organized mass of armed riders that did not arrive at a peaceful assembly by accident. She had maybe 40 seconds now. She held up the journal. The Dusk Accord, a unification agreement between the Veyrath territories and the Draven Pack, negotiated over 18 months by a Veyrath operative embedded in the Draven Inner Council. The goal is consolidation of all Northern Pack territories under Veyrath authority. The mechanism is this assembly. The timing is tonight. She looked out at the crowd. Not at Kael. Not at Marin. At the pack members who had ridden through 2 days of autumn cold because their leaders had told them this was a gathering of equals. You were brought here to be absorbed, not consulted, not allied with. Absorbed. Every pack on this ground that has not already signed Veyrath terms is a target for what is coming through that northern approach right now. Silence. Then the sound of the crowd turning, heads moving, bodies shifting, 600 wolves looking at the northern approach and seeing what Selena had already seen and understanding, in the specific visceral way that wolves understood threat. That the thing coming toward them was not escort. It was force. Kael moved, not toward Selena, toward Maren. She watched it happen and understood what it meant. He had crossed the distance between them in 5 long strides, and he had grabbed Maren's arm, and the thing on his face was not the Alpha King's managed authority. It was the raw, ugly expression of a man who has just had the full architecture of his own manipulation laid out in public in 60 seconds and is experiencing it in real time with no preparation and no managed response. "Signal them to stop," he said. Maren looked at him. Her face was doing what faces do when a plan has deviated from its projected path. Controlled recalibration, the expression of someone choosing between contingencies. "Kael, signal them to stop." His voice dropped to the register that wasn't for the assembly. Private, absolute. The voice of a man discovering that the thing he'd believed was a partnership was something else entirely, and experiencing that discovery in the most public possible setting. "Right now, or I will take that signal from you by force, and you will spend the rest of this night explaining to 600 witnesses what you came here to do." Maren's eyes moved to Selena on the dais, to the journal, to Heron, who had stepped forward with 2 other pack elders, and whose presence on this ground tonight was not accidental, to the Greenfen contingent, and the Brackenhold, and the Eastern packs whose faces she was mapping in real time against the intelligence she'd spent 18 months building, finding the gaps, understanding that the woman she'd spent 18 months managing had spent 10 days filling them. She gave the signal. It was small. A closed fist opened once, palm down. The riders at the northern approach slowed, stopped, held. The assembly grounds exhaled. What followed was not clean, and it was not quick, and it was nothing like the resolution of a thing that has been building for 18 months tends to be. It was 3 hours of assembly procedure under old law, with Heron presiding and 2 scribes recording and Selena standing at the dais for the first hour, and then seated before the council table for the second and third, because her legs made the decision her pride wouldn't have made on its own. She presented the journal. She presented her account of the archive correspondence with location details specific enough that 2 Alpha representatives left immediately to verify against the original documents. She answered every question put to her, including the ones designed to find the gaps in her account, including the ones Soren of the Brackenhold asked with the careful precision of a man who needed to be certain before he committed his pack to any position. She answered them all. Maren was detained on assembly grounds under old law provisions. Not imprisoned, not harmed, but held with witness, her communication suspended for the duration of the proceeding. She accepted this with the composed dignity of someone who had understood, from the moment Selena reached the top of the dais, that the night had moved past the point where any of her contingencies were still useful. She was not a woman who wasted energy on situations she could not change. Selena could respect the discipline even while understanding exactly what it had been used for. The Veyrath riders withdrew before dawn, not routed. They left, which was a different thing, the organized retreat of a force whose operational window had closed. They would return to their territories and regroup, and the problem of the Veyrath ambition was not solved tonight, only interrupted. Selena knew that. So did every Alpha in the assembly, but interrupted was enough. Interrupted was the thing that allowed the next conversation to happen. Kael found her when the formal proceedings had concluded and the assembly grounds were thinning, packs beginning the long rides home in the early gray of morning. She was at the eastern edge of the grounds where the torchlight faded into open air, standing with Corin a few feet away in the companionable proximity of someone who had ridden hard through dangerous country with her and wasn't inclined to be far away until she said otherwise. Kael stopped 6 feet from her. He looked at Corin. Corin looked at Selena. She gave a small nod, and Corin walked far enough away to be out of earshot and near enough to be present. Kael's face in the early morning light was the face of a man on the other side of something enormous, not broken. She didn't think Kael Draven knew how to be broken in the way most people were broken, the structural collapse, the inability to continue. He was still standing, but the standing had cost him everything that had made the standing look easy, and what remained was something she'd never seen before, even in the months before everything went wrong. Something uncovered. Something that had been underneath the Alpha King the whole time and had never been allowed up for air. She waited. He said, "I didn't know about the riders." "I know. I knew the Accord had force provisions. I believed they were last resort. I believed—" He stopped. His jaw worked. "I believed I was in control of the arrangement." "Yes," she said. "I know that too." He looked at her for a long moment. "You saved 600 wolves tonight." "I tried to save 600 wolves tonight. The trying worked this time." She looked at the grounds behind him, the torches burning low, the scribes packing the record documents, Heron speaking in low tones with the Eastern Pack elders. Next time requires different architecture. The Veyrath situation doesn't disappear because tonight didn't go their way. "I know." He looked at his hands, the gesture of a man unaccustomed to not knowing what to do with them. "I'd like to build that architecture with you." The words came out careful and stripped of the managing quality that had characterized everything he'd said to her for the last several months. No calculation underneath them. Or if there was, she couldn't find it, and she'd become very good at finding it. She said, "Tell me what you're actually asking." He looked up. "I'm asking you to come back. To the estate. To the position. To—" He stopped. Started differently, the way he'd started differently in her chamber at the 10th hour, choosing a different sentence because the first one wasn't true enough. "To me." She looked at him for a long time, long enough that the morning got perceptibly lighter and a bird started somewhere in the timber to the east, and Corin shifted his weight at the edge of her peripheral vision, not impatient, just present. She thought about what she wanted to give him. She thought about how easy it would be. Not the relationship, not the return to what they'd been. None of that was easy. But the yes. The yes was easy in the way that things are easy when you have loved someone deeply and they are standing in front of you undone and asking for what they should have asked for 18 months ago. The yes lived right there, accessible, almost automatic. She thought about the woman who had climbed an estate wall with a journal pressed against her ribs and a coin in her pocket and nothing else. The woman who had sat in kitchens and border posts and under pine trees telling the same true story 11 times until it was precise enough to matter. The woman who had taken 7 steps up a dais in the 60 seconds between one version of the world and another. That woman had been built in the last 3 weeks from materials that were always there and had never been given room. "No," she said. He absorbed it without flinching, which cost him something visible. "Selena. Not because I don't understand what you're asking, not because I don't know what you lost." She held his gaze. "I know what you lost. I was the one losing it alongside you for months before I understood that's what was happening." She looked at the assembly grounds, at the neutral ground that predated all of them and would outlast all of them. What I built in the last 3 weeks, the contacts, the network, the people who came to this ground tonight because someone they'd never met before told them a true thing, and they chose to believe it. That doesn't go back inside the East Wing. I'm not asking you to go back to the East Wing. You're asking me to go back to a structure where my work gets filtered through your authority, where my standing is contingent on your confidence in me, where the line between Luna and prisoner is exactly as wide as your trust in any given month. She said it without anger. It was the most important thing she'd said all night, and she gave it the weight it deserved. That's not a structure I can build anything in that lasts. He was quiet. "The Veyrath problem is real," she said. "The isolated pack problem that made the Accord seem reasonable to you. That's real too. I know that. The Greenfen territories and the Brackenhold need something. All of them do." She looked at him. "I'm going to build it. Not from inside your estate. From a position that doesn't require your permission to function." "You're talking about a separate territory." "I'm talking about something that doesn't exist yet. Something built from the ground up on the principle that wolves who don't have stone walls deserve the same counsel and the same legal standing as the ones who do." She watched his face absorb this. I'm going to need Nyla. I'm going to need the Greenfen's border access. I'm going to need the old law invocations that Heron helped me execute tonight to be formalized as precedent. And for me, his voice was very quiet now. Not the Alpha King's register, something older than the title. Don't interfere, she said. That's all. Don't use the Draven Pack's resources to obstruct what I'm building. Let Nyla leave cleanly. Honor the old law record from tonight. She paused. And stop letting people who don't know the names of your wolves make decisions about what happens to them. He stood with that for a long moment. She watched him hold the weight of it. Not just what she was saying, but what she wasn't saying. The space between the words where 18 months lived, and the mate chamber, and the letter on estate stationery, and all the accumulated cost of a man who had believed that managing a situation was the same as understanding it. I was wrong, he said. I need you to know that I know, she said. Simply, without cruelty and without absolution, because neither was hers to give. I know you were wrong. I also know you were afraid, and that the fear made the Accord look like protection, and that you made decisions inside that fear that you wouldn't make now. She held his gaze. That doesn't make the decisions right, but it makes them human. He looked at her with the open, unguarded face she'd seen for 1/2 second in the mate chamber doorway, the face beneath the Alpha King, and she understood that she was one of very few people who had ever seen it, and that this was its own kind of loss. That she had known him at that depth, and the depth hadn't been enough to survive what they'd put it through. Take care of the estate, she said. There are good wolves in it who stayed because they believed in what it was supposed to be. Don't make them wrong for staying. She picked up the journal. She turned toward where Corin was waiting. Selena. His voice one last time. She stopped. Didn't turn. The woman who stood on that dais tonight, he said, I never gave her the room to exist. I want you to know that I understand that now. She stood with it. Let it mean what it meant. Let it be true and insufficient and hers to carry or set down as she chose. She set it down. I know, she said, and walked toward the morning. 3 months later, on a piece of ground at the border junction of 4 territories that had never belonged to any one of them, Selena Voss broke the first foundation stone of what would eventually be called the Waymark. It was not a grand name. She hadn't wanted a grand name. Grand names belonged to things built for the story they told about themselves. What she was building was for function, a place where wolves without stone walls could bring their disputes, and their debts, and their border conflicts, and their sick, and find someone who knew the old law and the new law, and all the ground between them, someone who would look at them and know their names. Nyla arrived 6 days after the foundation stone with 2 mule carts and a particular expression on her face that meant she had strong opinions about where the infirmary should be positioned relative to the main hall and was going to share them. Corin's brother Aldrich sent 7 timber workers from the Greenfen without being asked. Soren of the Brackenhold sent a letter in his own hand that was 4 sentences long and said, among other things, that when his settlements needed legal counsel, they would send it here first, and that he trusted this would be reciprocated when the Waymark needed the Brackenhold's particular kind of geographic knowledge of the eastern passes. Heron came himself, in person, on a horse that was too old for the journey and made it anyway, and he sat with Selena by the foundation stones on his second evening and said, You know the Veyrath situation will come back. Yes, she said. Differently configured, better prepared for the assembly law invocation. Most likely. He looked at the construction around them. Rough and genuine, nothing ceremonial about it. The kind of building that looked like what it was and didn't pretend otherwise. You'll be better prepared too. Yes, she said. We will. He nodded. Looked at the evening sky. Kyle Draven sent a formal acknowledgement of the Waymark's territorial neutrality through the estate's official channels. He paused, witnessed and recorded under old law. She absorbed this, didn't look away from the sky. Good. He also sent something unofficially, through Wren, who has apparently become very interested in border logistics since the gathering. Heron produced a small folded paper and set it on the stone beside her. I was asked to deliver it and ask nothing about it. I am a man of my word. He went inside. She sat alone with the folded paper for a long time before she opened it. It was not a letter. It was a single sentence in Kael's handwriting, the same handwriting from the estate stationery, the same hand that had written her a letter about appropriate channels. And she held the paper and looked at the sentence and felt it land in the part of her that had never stopped knowing him even when everything else had fallen away. He had written, "I understand now that the strongest thing in my pack was the one I tried to contain, and I will spend the rest of my authority trying to be worthy of having known it." She folded the paper. She held it for one breath, 2, 3. She put it in the lining pocket of her outdoor wrap, where she'd once kept a greenfen border coin, and she sat in the late evening light on the foundation stones of something she was building herself, for reasons that belonged entirely to her, on ground that answered to no one's authority but the old law and the need of the wolves who would come to it. She thought about the woman who had stood at a corridor outside an orange-lit doorway 9 months ago and told herself she was imagining things. She thought about what that woman had known and what she hadn't, and what the distance between those two things had cost to cross. She didn't grieve that woman. She'd been necessary. The believing, the loving without reservation, the refusal to be cynical about what people could be to each other. None of what Selena had built in the last 3 months existed without the woman who had first believed it was possible for something to be real and lasting and worth the full weight of herself. You don't become what survives by discarding what you were. You carry it. You let it sit beside the harder thing you've become, and you stop demanding they resolve into a single consistent person, because they won't. And that's not failure. That's just what it looks like when a life has been actually lived in it. She looked out at the border ground, at the timber going up in the evening light, at Nyla's lantern moving in the infirmary space, steady and purposeful, the light of someone who knows what they're doing and is doing it without apology. She thought about Kael's sentence, about what it had cost him to write it and send it through unofficial channels so she would receive it without ceremony, without the machinery of titles and records, just one person telling another person a true thing across the distance they'd put between themselves. She hoped he meant it. She thought he did. She was done making herself responsible for the hope. What she was responsible for was here. The foundation stone under her hands, still rough from the breaking. The mule carts Nyla had brought with the medical supplies stacked precisely, because Nyla did nothing imprecisely. The 7 timber workers from the green fen who had eaten dinner with her last night and asked careful, respectful questions about what this place was supposed to be, and had listened to the answers with the attention of people deciding whether to believe in something. She had told them, it's supposed to be what you need it to be, not what someone with a title decided you needed, what you actually need, which you know better than anyone with a title does. They had looked at each other across the dinner fire in the particular way of people who have been managed for a long time and are encountering something different and are not quite sure yet whether to trust it. She understood that. Trust was not the first thing. Trust was what grew in a place after you'd seen what it was made of and found it solid. She wasn't asking for trust. She was building the thing, and she was going to let it be what it was, and the trust would come or it wouldn't, and she was going to keep building regardless. She stood. She brushed the stone dust from her hands. She looked at the ground and the timber and the evening light going gold over the border territory that didn't belong to any one pack and therefore belonged to all of them. She had been a Luna who built things for a kingdom that didn't let her own the building. Now she was building something that would outlast the question of what she was allowed to be. She walked toward the light of Nyla's lantern. Behind her, the first walls of the waymark stood in the early dark, rough and deliberate, and entirely, completely hers. She did not look back. She never needed to again.